Okay, hi. We're going to be covering threats to biodiversity today. And I know it looks like it's only a small portion of this, but this is kind of a pretty big bulk of the unit. So we're going to be looking at the estimates of the number of species on Earth, why it's difficult to have an exact figure. We're going to look at which species have yet to be identified, still which groups. And then we're going to be looking at examples of human activity that cause species extinction. So we're going to be looking at a whole slew of those and some examples of that. And lastly, we're going to look at factors that make a species more or less vulnerable to extinction. In the next class, in the next video in the next class, we'll be looking at the IUCN Red List conservation as well as a bunch of case studies. Okay, so let's take a look at our threats to biodiversity and get started. Okay, so first of all, how many species are left on the planet? Well, we aren't 100% sure. Maybe 7 million is a guess. That's not including bacteria. But we've only probably described 2 million at the most, if we're lucky. And most mammals we think we know, and birds, as well as a lot of plants. But you can see there's a number of different organisms like fungi. Look at that. For fungi, there's so many that have been described and that haven't been described in comparison to how many there have been. So they think there could be like 60 or 600,000 to 10 million possibly, and we've only described about 100,000 of them. Animals, you can see we have a larger chunk here, and then plants, we've done lots and lots there. So the smaller organisms with the animals are a little bit harder to locate because they're just, deep in the rainforest or harder to get away or hard to notice because they're small. And so a lot of those things haven't been described as well as others. But like you think about the big mammals and the birds that we see really easily, those ones are more easily described. And so those ones have been recorded. You can see, again, looking at the percentages, here's the vertebrates. So we think about fish and amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. Those are the vertebrates, lots and lots of those. But other animals like mollusks, maybe only 35%. Insects, probably only 11%. Arachnids, that's like spiders, so 10. Crustacean, that's, obviously the ones that are in the ocean. So a pretty small section there. And then you can see between protozoa, algae, fungi, and plants. Okay. Although this number, 70%, is quite different than this document, right? So you can see that different people have different opinions on how many more there are to go. Okay, so extinction rates. We looked at this last class a little bit. Essentially, we know that there is something we call a background extinction rate. Species evolve and go extinct ever since the beginning, but we've seen some mass extinctions, and that's when we have an extinction rate that's much faster than the background rate. And our current extinction is 1,000 times faster than the normal background rate. And so we're losing probably about 100 species per million per year. You're going to see some of the more recent estimates where we're in danger of losing 1 million of those 7 million species that we think might be on the planet today. So we're looking at our sixth mass extinction. And so at this point, it says almost 20,000 more species are threatened with extinction. But the most recent estimates have it at a much higher rate than that. A lot of these extinctions are taking place in hotspots. These are the most vulnerable because 50% of all species are found on just 2% of the Earth's area. And so you can see, we see in a lot of tropical rainforests and coral reefs in the warmer areas where we see a whole bunch of different organisms in unique areas like Madagascar. So these hotspots are places where we're losing species pretty quickly. Part of it too, when we start digging into protection, is that a lot of the hotspots are found in lesser economically developed countries. And so there's a balance that has to take place between, helping countries, with their economy and their standard of living, and also being able to maintain the biodiversity that's necessary for life on Earth, including us humans. Okay. Factors that help maintain biodiversity in general. We've looked at this, how complex it is, how deep are the nutrient cycling, are those food webs happening? Are there lots and lots of different organisms in the food web? How far it is in stages of succession. So later stages of succession make it usually more biodiverse. And if it's got really nice limiting not the limiting factors aren't putting a lot of pressure on. So a place that has very few limiting factors would be the tropical rainforest. It's warm, there's plenty of sunlight, lots and lots of primary productivity. Where a place that's biodiverse like that, in a rainforest or coral reef, they have a lot of primary productivity. But when you're looking at areas that have some limiting factors like deserts, tundra, they're not going to have as much biodiversity as those other places. But those are places that are vulnerable and need more protection because of that. The main threats to biodiversity that we're going to look at are direct threats like overexploitation from harvesting, poaching, illegal pet trade, and then indirect threats like habitat loss, climate change, pollution, invasive species. So looking at some of those direct threats like overexploitation, the oceans are a pretty sad state of affairs. We have outfished the oceans to a very large extent. And you see the bluefin tuna are an example here that they have become endangered because of the fishing industry, because it's hard to regulate fishing a lot of times in international waters. But we've also seen this of large mammals, right? Elephants. Just in 2 years ago, they found like 100 elephants that were slaughtered at one time in Botswana to take the tusks. It was mostly large males. And we've seen it drop from 415,000 African elephants on the continent down to only 111. So it's essentially lost 3/4 of its population in only 10 years. Other types of poaching has to do with either they're poaching them for, medicinal purposes like scales, or for pet trade. So slow loris and this red panda could be either for its fur or as a pet. So people really like to have these exotic animals as trophies. But unfortunately, we're seeing their numbers decline because they get trapped and sent to markets. And so you can see all of these terrible conditions often when they're being poached and taken because they're worth a lot of money. Habitat destruction is also a really big deal. This is more indirect threat, although it probably doesn't feel like it to the individuals that are there. And that can be pollution or fragmentation. So pollution, we know different types of pollution: oil spills, toxic substances, pesticides, things like that getting into our waterways or on the land, smog, acid rain, fertilizer runoff leading to eutrophication, and then, of course, carbon emissions that can lead to climate change. And then we've broken up and fragmented a vast portion of our land and our oceans even. So looking at that fragmentation, we see lots of forestry, logging, right? So you can see all that fragmentation here. What that does with all these clear cuts where there's the snow patches, that cuts up the environment. So there's much smaller patches for the organisms to live. So it's more difficult for them to find the regions they need. The edge effects make them more vulnerable to predators or to outside, hunters or poachers or things like that. And we all know what's going on in the palm forests because they're cutting those down to sell for palm oil. And that is affecting lots of different species there, and especially the orangutan. So those palm forests in Indonesia. So you destroy their habitat, you've taken away their food, their shelter, their space, basically the resources they need to survive. And if you cut it up into fragments, it's harder for them to get the things that they need because there's fewer of it. And it's also harder for them to travel safely in large corridors. Invasive species. So species often get introduced to different areas for a number of different reasons. And an alien species might or might not become invasive, but often they do because they don't have the predators that they would in their natural environment, because the predators don't know how to hunt them, don't know how to deal with them. Maybe they're more aggressive than normal than what the natural predators have evolved with. The prey species might not be as good at escaping. And so when these invasive species get in, they can do a number of things. They can eat a whole bunch of different organisms lower in the food chain, but they can also cause damage to the predators from competition that are on their same trophic level. This is the American, like the North American mink. So you've heard of mink coats and things like that can be popular with people to wear because they're warm and soft. Well, those were brought over to Europe because they're a little bit bigger than the European mink. They were brought over to Europe to be able to, farm them. A lot of them escaped, and they affect the trophic level by, first of all, they can actually eat birds. So they're eating a lot of things. They're more aggressive than the European mink, so they're eating a lot of different species that are lower on the trophic level, and that causes competition with the European minks and other organisms that are on the same trophic level because they're eating all the food. So that means there's less for the other species to live, the native ones. This is the lionfish. We're seeing that affect the coral reefs and the fish along coral reefs in the Caribbean, along South and Central America. It's an Asian fish. And so it's very poisonous, so it can hurt the predators that might eat it. And it also will eat a lot of the prey fish that it can get its hands on. Another indirect threat is climate change. So we know sea ice is breaking up. Polar bears are slated to be extinct probably within your lifetime because the sea ice in which they hunt on is disappearing rapidly. Some of them are making some adjustments, moving onto land, but now there's a lot more dangerous clashes with humans because of that. One of the first species to be threatened, technically endangered because of climate change, is the pika, this cute little rodent-type creature that lives at the top of mountains. And so as the world gets warmer, and all the way up to the top of the mountains, they just don't have anywhere to go anymore because they're not going to fly. Okay, so there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up is this disruption of interaction networks that's really important. If we hunt species that are keystone species, these are species that are responsible for maintaining community structure, like bats and bees. These are pollinators. If we lose these pollinators, then the plants will no longer be able to reproduce. And so that can totally destroy a community. The sea otter is a classic example of that. So the sea otter that lives off of the Pacific Ocean. So it goes all the way up the Pacific Ocean from California and North America up through Alaska and all the way over into Russia and Japan. Well, it's disappeared from most of its range. And of course, because it's soft and furry and people wanted to hunt it for its pelts. Well, when that disappeared, though, what they didn't realize is that this was a keystone species. You can see here's what the ocean areas look like there with sea otters and without. With the sea otters, what happens is they eat a whole bunch of sea urchins as one of their main meals, and that can help maintain these cool kelp forests. And that is it's like a tropical rainforest, an old growth forest for fish. They love this area. It really has lots of different habitats in it. It's super diverse. Well, when you take out the sea otters, the sea urchins take over and they eat all of the kelp, and then it disappears, destroying the habitat completely. So when you end up losing biodiversity from very important either top predators or pollinators or other keystone species, habitat engineers like beavers and elephants, that changes the landscape dramatically, and it might not ever change back. Okay, so things that make a species more or less prone to extinction are things like how big is the population, how specialized are they in what they eat and what they require, how quickly can they breed, what's their behavior, their trophic level, and a few different things. So we'll explore some examples. So if they have really small population sizes, especially if they're kind of in pockets and they can't get get to that, or they've got a small gene pool. They can't adapt to any major disturbances. And if they've got a really small area, one disturbance can wipe out the whole population. But if they're more widely distributed across a larger expanse in the globe, you could have a disturbance in one place, but that population maintains in another. This is the dhole. It's the Asiatic wild dog, and it's only in a few small areas within India. Habitat specialists like pandas and koala bears, things that require just one thing, that makes them vulnerable to extinction, because if you lose the bamboo forests, pandas have nothing to eat. If you lose the eucalyptus forests, like in these massive wildfires that happened in Australia, you're going to lose a significant portion of the koala bears, because that's what they eat. So being a specialist makes you more vulnerable to extinction than something that can maybe say, oh, well, maybe I'm going to eat this tree instead of that tree, or maybe I can eat, berries or something else. Having a low reproductive capacity, like K-selected species, makes you more vulnerable too, because you can't replace your numbers as quickly as people are going to start to hunt you. So that's why these big land animals are super vulnerable, because they live for a long time. They don't have babies for a long time. Their generation time is just really long in comparison to, say, like a dandelion that could put out its seeds really quickly, or a mouse. So if there's a disturbance, there's just too few reproductive adults to really bring that population back. Being a poor competitor, the dodo is a classic example you'll probably look at when you look at a species that's gone extinct. But they couldn't compete with other organisms very well. They're not aggressive. They would just sit there and not run away if there was some sort of predator there. So they went extinct really quickly, because they didn't seem to be afraid of humans or other predators. And so people would just pick them off really quickly. And also they just couldn't compete for food with the other ones that were more aggressive. Large mammals are really in particular threatened, because people think they're exotic, and they're also a large source of meat. So if you are a hunter, it's one of the reasons why they think the woolly mammoth probably disappeared, as it got out hunted by humans. So it's a large source of meat. Rather than having to catch a bunch of fast little things, if you can catch one large one, you can feed a lot more into people. But also they're exotic, and people want to hunt them. Lastly, if you're bigger, you need more range. You need a much bigger space to live. So if you fragment that forest, that means a lot less resources for you to survive on, and you need a lot more. So the ranges of things like a jaguar could be 200 kilometers squared or more. So to have enough land to support a large animal is really difficult. And of course, valuable products. So if your horn or your tusk is something that is valued, you're going to be a lot more vulnerable to humans wanting to hunt you. And a lot of times, as in within elephants, they don't just go and, sedate the elephant, take the tusks off. They actually will cut off the face. They kill the elephant and take the tusks all the way down. And you can see rhinos as well. Okay, seasonal migrants. These are ones that live in more than one place. And so you can imagine, if you winter here and you summer here, there's a whole lot of range that needs to be protected. So if something happens here, then they're in trouble. So just having a bunch of different places that you have to rely on can make it more difficult to survive. Poor dispersers. So if you're really big and you can't get your seeds out very far, or you only have one egg and can't fly, you're not going to be able to move as quickly as something that can send its seeds really far away. If you live on an island and you can't fly, you can't migrate. And altruistic species, because they can be gunned down pretty quickly. So if a wolf is being attacked, the other wolves will stick around to defend it. So more wolves will get killed. Same thing with elephants. So they stay together to help each other, but it makes them more easily killed. Clumping can be an issue too. If you live in larger herds, you can be gunned down more easily. The passenger pigeon is a classic example of a species that went extinct. And And because they lived in such large colonies, people could just go in and take tons and tons and tons of them all at once. And then the top predators tend to be the most vulnerable, because if anything else gets lost lower in the food chain, that directly impacts them. So the higher you are on the food chain, the more links that can be lost that could result in your collapse. And then, of course, bioaccumulation and biomagnification happen higher in the food chain. Well, bioaccumulation happens all along the food chain, but biomagnification happens higher. Okay, so that is the section that we have covered so far, up to number 5 on our questions to consider. And in our next video, we'll look at the red list and conservation status, and then you're going to be working on a whole bunch of case studies. All right.